Karen from the HOA had the audacity to pull my dog's drinking fountain out of my yard, all because of neighborhood aesthetic rules. I've always thought that the concept of living in a neighborhood with an HOA, homeowners association, was kind of tacky, you know? Bored people with too much time on their hands and overinflated egos, creating absurd rules about what kind of curtain you can have on your window, or exactly how many inches your grass can grow before it's considered an attack on neighborhood morals. But after years of living in a big city, chaotic traffic and sirens as a soundtrack, I decided to seek peace. I bought a charming little house in a quiet suburb, thinking I'd finally found paradise. What a joke. The first few months were quiet, I swear. My 2 dogs, 2 mongrels who are more civilized than many people out there, loved the yard. They ran around, played, and of course, they had their automatic drinking fountain there, under the tree, with shade and everything. Always fresh water, as it should be. Then, one fine day, she appeared. The woman who looked like she'd stepped straight out of a How to Be Insufferable in 10 Steps manual. She wore a beige blouse, tailored pants, even in 35-degree heat, and a plastic smile on her face that already gave away her falsehood. First it was paperwork. He came knocking at my door with a little pad and a bunch of plasticized forms. HOA rules, she said, as if she were offering golden tickets to heaven. I listened. I was polite, but I ignored 90% of what she said, because, frankly, no one with common sense cares what shade is allowed for garden stones. But no, she didn't give up, because that kind of woman never gives up. The power of the electric fence inspector messes with their brains in a way that even therapy can't solve. One day, I came home and noticed that something was different. The dogs were agitated. The ground near the tree was dry. Where was the drinking fountain? Gone. I thought it was a prank, until I searched the whole yard, thinking that some prankster neighbor had played a joke on me. But then I found a little piece of paper on the gate. It was handwritten in such a round font that it made me angry. Equipment removed for not conforming to community aesthetic standards. HOA. I was shocked. That's no exaggeration. They removed my animal's drinking fountain. A drinking fountain. A dog's. In a yard. Private. I stood there staring at that note like someone staring at a betrayal. Because that's exactly what it was. A betrayal of logic, of common sense, of the slightest empathy with a living being. And do you know what annoyed me the most? The feeling of helplessness. Because, in the bizarre world of HOAs, these figures think of themselves as judge, jury, and executioner at the same time, as if they had received a heavenly diploma that gives them the right to decide what can and cannot exist within their own fence. And the worst part, I knew who had done it. Her, the woman in the tailored pants, the queen of control, the embodiment of I command and you obey. The same woman who had already complained about the exaggerated height of my flowers. The same one who had tried to find me because my garbage can was visible for exactly 11 minutes after collection. I sat down, took a deep breath, and looked at my dogs, with their tongues hanging out, waiting for water, as if they were on a reality survival show. And that's when it hit me. This woman had chosen the wrong person to poke. I wasn't going to let it go, because it's one thing to be annoying, but it's quite another to mess with my animals. And if you mess with them, you mess with what little sanity I have left. It took me exactly 4 minutes to come out of my state of shock and go into revenge mode. It wasn't even a conscious process, it was automatic. Like when you step on a nail and the reaction is to jump back, cursing all the saints. I looked at the dry pots, at the eyes of my dogs who didn't understand a thing, and felt a mixture of anger, contempt, and an almost spiritual desire to return the humiliation in kind. But in my own way. It wasn't enough just to put another drinking fountain in place. That's what she'd expect. What she wanted, in fact. A reason to come back here, write another pathetic little note, and parade around the neighborhood, as if she'd won the Cold War of dog water. I needed to do something that would make her feel, taste the absurdity, the invasion, the loss of control. And that's when divine irony came into play, with a detail I had completely forgotten about. The water supply to her house ran through my land. That's right, the house of the woman who unilaterally decided to rip out a water fountain for my dogs was connected to a water system that depended on my space. An old project from the subdivision, poorly planned, which ended up leaving my property as an intermediary between her and the wet world. I always knew this, of course, but I never cared, because, until then, I had never needed it. But now I had a magic button that could return the neglect with the same intensity, and all within the law. I started by acting quietly. I went to the part of the yard where the pipe ran, opened the access box, and looked at the valves. One of them clearly controlled the water entering her house. It was there, all imposing, but at the same time vulnerable, like some kind of hydraulic neck waiting for the guillotine. I stared at it for a good few minutes, almost as if I were talking to the valve. Like, "Are you sure about this? Are we really going to do this?" And the valve, with its iron silence, replied, "Cut, Dad." And I did. No violence, no scandal, just a twist. A simple twist. And with that, the fountain ran dry. Literally. The woman who ripped out a water trough for my animals in the name of community aesthetics was now going to face the aesthetics of thirst. I imagined the scene of her turning on the tap in the morning and not a drop coming out, trying to flush the toilet and hearing nothing but the dry sound of desperate plumbing. The indignation that probably surged through her body like a wave of muffled despair. I could almost hear the muffled cry of, "My God, what's happening to my water?" From here, I waited 2 days, 2 whole days. I wanted to see how far it would go before I realized. And, lo and behold, they were 2 delicious days. No breakfast has ever tasted as sweet as the one on that Saturday, when I saw her in her bathrobe, disheveled, walking down the street with a bucket, trying to ask her next-door neighbor for some water. I almost cried with laughter. You know that almost forbidden pleasure of seeing justice done without you even having to raise your voice? That was it. But of course, she wasn't going to let it go. Because when people lose control, they freak out. First, she tried knocking on doors with the aggressive manner of someone who looks worried but wants to make their frustration known in public. Then she sent an email to all HOA members talking about serious technical problems with the plumbing in her house and asking for suggestions of reliable plumbers. Her victim face was almost Oscar-worthy, but what really made me laugh was when she suggested, in the email, that perhaps the street supply was being sabotaged. Sabotaged. The queen of control, now turned conspiracy theory nut. I knew that one day she would come to me, and she did. On the 3rd day without water, she knocked on my door with that forced expression of desperate civility, a smile that looked more like a threat. I didn't open it. I just looked out of the window, waved goodbye, and went back to watering my plants, with a hose in front of her, with water flowing freely, as if I had a private waterfall and she lived in the Sahara. Her expression was a poem, a mixture of shock, anger, and a hint of pleading that she tried to disguise with arrogance. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Silence sometimes hurts more than shouting. I went back inside and left her there, her dignity gradually melting away under the afternoon sun. It was funny to see how someone so used to being in charge would fall apart when she was forced to ask. But really, ask. No plasticized papers, no authoritative tone, no confidence that the world would obey just because she was talking. That night, I received an email from the HOA, a formal request to discuss neighborhood infrastructure issues. Surely written by her, but signed by some other poor bastard on the committee, probably coerced into mediating the crisis. I didn't reply. I waited, because sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to let the other side taste the bitterness of their own arrogance. And honestly, she hadn't suffered enough yet. By then, I was no longer angry. It had become something else, an almost artistic delight, a silent performance of poetic justice. It was as if I were painting a picture, brushing each moment with delicious details that only those who have suffered absurdities can savor. And she, the woman who ruled the neighborhood as if she had inherited it from a medieval king, was now in the middle of the chaos she herself had built. I knew she wouldn't be able to maintain control for long, not without water. Her house looked like a post-apocalyptic movie set. Yellow grass, wilted flowers, no one in the yard, even the sound of the birds was gone. They'd probably fled in protest. I walked slowly past with my dog, pretending to look at my cell phone as I watched the silent tragedy unfolding in that house. The woman who once paraded around with clipboards and lists of prohibitions was now hiding behind the curtains, keeping an eye on the street, as if she were watching to see if salvation would fall from the sky. Literally. And it didn't. What fell was the plug. It took a while, but it fell. On the fourth day, she finally broke down. She came to my door again, only this time without her association president costume. She was wearing a sweatshirt with deep-set eyes, and her hair looked like she'd had a fight with a fan and lost. He rang the doorbell 3 times. I waited longer than necessary to open the door. I like to build tension. When I opened the door, I was silent. I just stared. She tried to smile, but it was no longer the smile of a woman who thought she had control over everything. It was the smile of someone about to beg. She began with a rehearsed speech, trying to sound diplomatic. She talked about unexpected problems, about the importance of harmony in the community, about misunderstandings that happen between neighbors. I held back my laughter, because there's nothing funnier than seeing someone trying to look superior while being completely defeated. I kept listening, not a shred of real apology, just an attempt to reposition the narrative to make it look like it was all just a big mistake. Oh, right. It was a mistake to rip out my dog's drinking fountain and leave 2 animals in the sun, because it didn't go well with the rose bushes in the neighborhood. I told her she needed to think about it, that maybe, with some compensation, I could reopen access to the water. Only I wasn't talking about money. I wanted moral compensation, something that would cost her, something that would affect her soul. And that's when I had the most brilliant idea of my existence. I proposed that she write a letter, an open letter to the whole neighborhood, admitting her mistake, explaining that she had removed the drinking fountain without permission, and that this was, in quotes, a completely unnecessary abuse of authority that put the health of innocent animals at risk, close quote. I said that only after this letter had been delivered to all the mailboxes in the neighborhood would I consider turning the water back on. She went mute. The shock on her face was so pure that you could frame it. It wasn't just shame. It was the panic of losing the throne she had built for herself, based on meaningless rules and veiled threats. The idea of admitting a mistake publicly must have seemed to her the equivalent of ripping off her own skin. And that's why it was perfect. Of course, she tried to negotiate. She offered to pay to have the water fountain repaired. She offered to reinstall a new model. She even tried to put the blame on the gardening company, who mixed up the orders. I listened to everything, with the calmest face in the world, because there was nothing she could offer that would be worth more than the public humiliation of an apology. Not for revenge, but for justice. Because sometimes, the only way to teach someone who believes they are superior is to make them taste their own poison. Out loud, with witnesses. Over the next few days, silence took over. She disappeared, probably trying to find a way out of this without fulfilling the requirement. But time was against her, because without water, the house became a desert. And a desert doesn't sustain anyone's ego. A week later, I received an envelope. No sender, but with the handwriting of an elementary school teacher that she made a point of keeping. I opened it, and there it was, the letter. 4 whole paragraphs, almost choked with forced regret, but with every sentence I demanded. Even the term abuse of authority was underlined. I laughed. I really did. I sat on the balcony, read it out loud to my dogs, who looked at me with the same, "What is this crazy woman doing now?" look, and then I took a dozen copies and started walking around the neighborhood, putting them in the mailboxes, one by one. The next day, she didn't show up on the street, nor the next. The HOA meetings had been canceled for personal reasons, and no one was talking about it. But the smiles on the faces of the neighbors when they met me said it all. One of them even commented, half laughing, that he found it strange that a person so concerned about the image of the neighborhood had disappeared so suddenly. I relitigated the water, not because it deserved it, but because the lesson had been learned. And I'm not a sadist, just meticulous. The woman now knew that, behind every well-painted fence, there is someone who may just be waiting for a good reason to strike back, and that no one, absolutely no one, is above decency. If I were to write a survival manual for those living in an HOA neighborhood, the first chapter would be, "Never underestimate the level of delusion of someone with an association president badge." The second chapter would be about how it's possible to win a war without giving a single shout, just letting the person slip in their own arrogance while you watch with a cup of coffee in your hand. And the third would be about how to deal with the consequences after the fall of an empire built on inflated ego and contempt for common sense. After the letter episode, the neighborhood entered a kind of undeclared truce. Nobody spoke directly about what had happened, but the atmosphere was different. It was as if everyone was relieved, breathing lighter, less afraid of being fined for leaving a bicycle on the lawn for 5 minutes. The woman's silence became the new ambient sound. There were no more daily inspection rounds with a notebook in hand, no more kind notes threatening sanctions for non-standard pots. But what really surprised me was the power of a small symbolic victory. Because after she retreated into her own shame, other residents began to rebel. Small rebellions, subtle, but full of meaning. One neighbor painted his garage door bright red. Another planted sunflowers where previously only grass was allowed. And there was even one who, for the first time, parked his car on the street overnight. The famous cardinal sin according to the HOA manual. No one said it was because of the license, but I know it was. It was the domino effect of freedom coming back into circulation. And the woman, the one who once paraded with the pomp of someone who thinks she's going to be buried with a neighborhood Medal of Honor, began to feel the weight of her own isolation. Because when power comes down from its pedestal, only the person is left. And in her case, there wasn't much left. The smiles she used to get turned into cold stares. The meetings she used to run turned into absences justified by vague emails. Even the occasional allies, those who loved to pull her leg to get faster approvals for renovations or discounts on fees, disappeared like cockroaches when the lights came on. Nobody wants to be seen next to a leaky boat. A month later, I received an unexpected message. It was from the HOA itself, but not a bossy note or an infraction notice, but an invitation. They wanted me to attend a special meeting with other residents to discuss leadership restructuring. I confess I laughed. The irony of someone like me, who has always avoided any kind of involvement with this circus, now being asked to help change the show, was too delicious to ignore. So I went. I sat at the back of the room, listened to the complaints of the others, all with their stories choked up from years of being silenced by a woman who turned whim into regulation. And there, in that stuffy room, full of plastic chairs and watery coffee, I realized that I wasn't the only one who was tired. I'd only been the first to take the step. They wanted to start again, to throw out that absurd rule book, to revise the regulations, to transform the HOA into something less authoritarian and more functional. And they asked me for help, not to lead, because God forbid I should be the new liquidator from hell, but to give an opinion, to suggest, to bring common sense to the table. I accepted, on one condition, that every new document had a clause saying that decisions about pets could could only be made on the basis of public health or safety, and never on aesthetic grounds. No one complained. There was even applause. And the woman? She officially stepped down shortly afterwards. She sent a short, emotionless email saying that she needed to devote herself to personal issues. No one replied, and I knew at that moment that her downfall was complete. The throne had become a stool in the square, and she, who thought she was unattainable, had to learn the hard way that power without respect is worthless. Days returned to normal. My dogs got a new drinking fountain, even bigger, with LED lights and an automatic filtering system. I've put a little sign on the side saying, "Crazy-free territory." Just for fun. The whole neighborhood began to change its tune. People started greeting each other more, stopping on the sidewalk to chat, complaining about things together instead of hiding for fear of punishment. Little by little, the neighborhood became the place I imagined when I moved here. A real place. And me? I got on with my life, not with the pride of having won a war, but with the certainty that sometimes all you need to bring down a castle of stupid rules is to make the person who built it drink the same water they tried to take from others. Or rather, go without. Don't forget to leave your likes and opinions in the comments.